One of the most horrific scenarios a parent can face is losing track of their child in a dangerous or unknown environment. The same goes for animals too. When any animal parent loses sight of their precious offspring, they become equally as anxious. But what do you do when you find someone's lost children and you have no idea how to reach the rightful parents? After a terrible cyclone struck in a neighborhood in India, a man named Peter discovered a chipmunk's nest that had been knocked out of a tree next to his home. There were 4 terrified babies inside, and Peter knew he had to find their mother quickly if they had any chance of surviving. But how? After a cyclone tore through his neighborhood in India, a man named Peter decided to venture outdoors to survey the damage, and he was shocked. There, in a fallen tree, was a nest with 4 tiny baby chipmunks still inside. The cyclone that ripped through Peter's neighborhood had winds that reached up to almost 90 miles per hour. It was a wonder that the chipmunks had survived the storm, let alone crashing to the ground along the tree. The nest had blown out of the tree, and while the chipmunks seemed okay, they were alive. Miraculously, they were far too young to survive without their mother, but what had happened to her? And how could Peter help them? As soon as Peter confirmed the chipmunks weren't injured, he immediately brought them into his home so they'd be out of danger. He knew they needed some kind of nourishment after such a frightening ordeal. Peter looked through his fridge to see what he could give the chipmunks, and he figured a small bit of milk would do the trick. He placed a few drops in front of them as a test, and sure enough, the babies all lapped it up. Peter then had an even better idea. He would put the milk into a syringe and feed them like newborn babies drinking out of a bottle. The chipmunks immediately took to this method, and Peter carefully fed them one at a time. Even though each one seemed to initially be in good shape, Peter realized they were likely all dehydrated and starving. Each one of the chipmunks was drinking out of the syringe as if they hadn't had any nourishment in days. The milk Peter gave the babies seemed to provide them with a lot more energy, at least, a good sign. They'd been slow moving when he first brought them inside, but after feeding them, the little guys started climbing all over him. Peter then introduced the furry little critters to his cat, Nettie. At first, it seemed like Nettie didn't know exactly what to think of the babies. She was clearly curious. She'd never seen another animal in the house before. Peter was afraid she would lose interest in the chipmunks. However, all it took was a few minutes of sniffing around, and Nettie suddenly seemed smitty with the chipmunks. Peter breathed a huge sigh of relief as he watched Nettie lick the babies as if they were her own. Almost immediately after the adorable introduction, Nettie started playing with the chipmunks, and all 4 loved the attention she was giving them. She laid on her back and let the babies run all over her belly. The babies just could not get enough attention from both Peter and Nettie. Even when Peter would try to walk across the room, he couldn't. The chipmunks would just curl up around his toes. As adorable as these little critters were, Peter knew that they couldn't stay in his care forever. Somewhere nearby was their frightened mother, and she was probably searching all over the area for them. It was finally time to try to reunite the babies with their family. He placed the chipmunk's nest, which he kept in a box outside his front door on his porch. Much to Peter's relief, it didn't take long at all before the rest of the family showed up. The mother instantly came bounding up the porch stairs in search of her children. Peter was thrilled that she heard their cries. He hoped she would rescue all 4. After the cyclone, they needed their mother badly. The mother grabbed the first baby in her mouth and darted off. Would she return for the rest of them? Peter watched the action from inside, so the mother wasn't too frightened to perform her daring rescue mission. Thankfully, the mother chipmunk returned. One by one, she took a baby chipmunk and darted back off the porch. Peter walked outside to see if any of the babies were left. He dug around in the nest, and his heart sank. There was one more in the nest. The mother chipmunk forgot one. Peter picked up the final baby chipmunk from the nest and placed him directly on the porch. The mother would have to realize one of her precious babies was missing, right? After gently placing the little guy down, Peter went back inside to wait. He stared out his window at the lonely baby. He had no idea if the mother would come back, but he was keeping his fingers crossed. He was going to wait for as long as it took, but he couldn't be certain about anything. You can only imagine how terrified the baby chipmunk must have been. Would his mother return one final time for him? Peter anxiously waited. People like Peter help make this world a better place. We know how terrified the mother chipmunk was, and he did everything in his power to help.